The Tower of London does not sleep. Even in the still hours before dawn, when the Thames drifts black and silent beneath its walls, the fortress breathes with the weight of centuries. Its stones groan, its turrets lean in shadow, its corridors echo with the memory of iron chains and muffled cries. The tower has held kings and traitors, martyrs and monsters. Tonight, in May of 1536, it holds a queen, Anne Boleyn. She is 35 years old, though fear and sleeplessness carve deeper lines upon her face. Once she dazzled Europe's courts with wit and dark eyes, her laughter bright as wine, her words sharp as daggers. Once kings bent laws and kingdoms for her, priests tore apart the unity of Christendom at her command. But now she sits alone in a chamber meant for prisoners, her crown stripped, her fate sealed. In days, perhaps hours, the sword will fall. The tower is quiet save for the tramp of guards outside her door. Yet silence is never empty. It carries whispers. They seep through the walls, down corridors, into the cells of the accused. They rise like smoke, suffocating, inescapable. For Anne, the whispers are worse than death itself. They say she has betrayed her king, that she has betrayed God, that she has betrayed nature itself. Not merely adultery, but incest. The charge is monstrous, unthinkable, a crime so vile that even to speak it is to court damnation. Chroniclers write it as though certain that when Henry VIII's passion cooled, Anne turned not to strangers but to her own brother George, that she shared with him her body, that she conceived a child of sin, a rival heir born not of kingly seed but of incestuous union. The whispers paint her as a queen transformed into a beast, a woman who corrupted blood and throne alike. The truth is smothered beneath torchlight slander. No proof exists, no witness saw what enemies claim, yet the rumour spreads faster than fire. At court, men nod knowingly, in taverns, women cross themselves and spit. In churches, preachers thunder that England's queen was a Jezebel, a witch, a corrupter of holy order. The more obscene the story, the more it is believed. And here, within these walls, Anne waits. Her chamber is bare, lit only by a single candle. Its flame trembles in the draught, casting shadows across the stone. She kneels upon the floor, her rosary clutched between pale fingers. She prays, her lips moving silently, though whether to God, to mercy, or to history itself, no one can say. At times she weeps, at times she laughs suddenly, hysterically, the sound echoing too loudly. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, writes of her moods in letters to Cromwell. This morning she did laugh, and then weep, and then laugh again. Every gesture, every tremor of emotion becomes fuel for her enemies. A queen who laughs on the edge of death must surely be mad. A queen who prays too fervently must surely be guilty. Beyond her walls, George Boleyn too paces in chains, handsome, eloquent, the darling of poets and courtiers. He is now branded in the same fire as his sister. To their enemies, their closeness is no longer loyalty but proof. They dined together, wrote verses together, shared confidences. What in one light was love of family is in another painted as lust. Court is a hall of mirrors, and every gesture reflects what enemies wish it to. The tower groans with the weight of the coming trial. Already the scaffold is being prepared. Carpenters work in the yard, hammering wood into the shape of death. Outside, London murmurs with gossip. People crowd taverns to hear the latest rumour, to speculate on the Queen's fall. They whisper of witchcraft, of poisons, of adultery with courtiers, of incest with George. Each rumour is darker than the last, yet each is repeated as if carved in stone. In the shadows of St. Paul's, a preacher declares that God has revealed the truth at last. The king was deceived, the nation cursed by a harlot queen. In the palace, courtiers who once bowed to Anne now avoid her name, already aligning themselves with Jane Seymour, the new star in Henry's eye. Power shifts quickly in Tudor England, and scandal is the grease upon its wheels. Inside the tower, Anne writes letters, to Henry pleading her innocence, reminding him of love once sworn. To her family, begging prayers. To her daughter Elizabeth, though the child is too young to read, words of maternal devotion that may never reach her hands. She writes as if ink might defend her where justice has already failed. But paper cannot erase rumour, and the whispers grow louder. Chroniclers record them with relish. George Wyatt, writing decades later, repeats them as though fact. Others twist her story into morality plays, where Anne is Eve seducing Adam into ruin, or Jezebel, painted with her brother's lust. The incest charge is more than accusation, it is narrative. It transforms Anne from queen to monster, from victim of politics to architect of her own damnation. Truth matters less than the shape of the tale. In the flicker of torchlight, the line between fact and slander disappears. Anne kneels in prayer, but the crowd sees only Jezebel. George defends himself, but the crowd hears only incestuous laughter. Henry VIII, once so consumed by her that he tore Christendom apart, now believes nothing but betrayal. And so in May of 1536, the Tower of London holds not just a queen awaiting death, but a story being born, a story of lust, betrayal, sin, and punishment. A story so shocking it will echo for centuries. A story where history bends beneath the weight of scandal until no one can tell where truth ends and invention begins. The candle flickers low. Outside, the scaffold waits. Inside, the queen whispers her prayers, her laughter, her tears, and all around her the tower whispers too, of adultery, of treason, of incest. Whether she is guilty or not no longer matters. The story has already written itself. And in that story Anne Boleyn is remembered not for her crown, not for her daughter who will one day rule England, not even for the kingdom her ambition reshaped. She is remembered for the whisper of incest that clung to her name like a curse. The tower sleeps, but uneasily, for within its walls a queen awaits death, and a scandal is being born that will outlive her by centuries. England in the year 1536 is not yet the sprawling empire it will become. It is a kingdom perched on a knife's edge, its crown fragile, its dynasty barely 30 years old. The Tudors, though crowned in glory after the bloody Wars of the Roses, remain haunted by instability. Their throne rests on uncertain ground, their claim contested by rival branches of Plantagenet blood. And in such a world, one truth weighs heavier than all others. A king without a son is a king without a future. The Tudor crown had been born in blood and gamble. Henry VII seized it in battle, his lineage too thin to silence enemies. He secured his throne not with conquest alone, but with marriage to Elizabeth of York binding the red rose to the white. Their union promised peace, legitimacy, and most importantly, heirs. For a king's body mattered less than the bodies he produced to succeed him. Sons were insurance, daughters merely bargaining chips in the chessboard of Europe. Henry VIII, heir to this fragile legacy, learned the lesson well. He was no mere king, he was the guardian of a dynasty precariously perched between triumph and ruin. When he ascended the throne in 1509, young, handsome and vigorous, England rejoiced. Here was a prince in golden armour, a king who would lead the realm into a new age. But behind the pageantry lay a truth that gnawed at the marrow of his reign. He must sire sons. Without them, all was dust. Queens were not chosen for love, nor for charm, nor for learning. They were chosen as vessels. A queen was a womb in a crown, her worth measured in the cradle. If she gave sons, she was sainted. If she gave daughters, she was pitied. If she gave nothing, she was cursed. And if she gave birth to sons who died in infancy, she was suspected of sin, witchcraft, or divine disfavour. Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, had done her duty as best she could. She gave him a daughter, Mary, and many pregnancies that ended in stillbirths or short-lived infants, but no son who lived. As years passed, the king's hope curdled into bitterness. Catherine grew older, her body weary, her womb barren. The king, still vigorous, still hungry for legacy, began to see her not as partner, but as obstacle. For each year without a son, the Tudor throne trembled. England itself joined in this obsession. Every noble, every courtier, every peasant in the fields knew that without a male heir, the realm was vulnerable to civil war. Memories of the Wars of the Roses lingered like scars, a warning of what happens when succession falters. A daughter might rule in theory, but in practice she was seen as weakness. Her claim, a prize for rival suitors, her marriage a gateway for foreign control. A boy was certainty, continuity, power. A girl was uncertainty, danger, and foreign meddling. Into this fevered world stepped Anne Boleyn. She arrived not as a queen, not even as a bride, but as a lady-in-waiting. Dark-eyed, sharp-witted, raised in the courts of Burgundy and France, she was unlike the docile English maidens around her. She had learned the art of conversation, the elegance of fashion, the poetry of courtly love. She carried with her the sophistication of the continent, the allure of mystery, the confidence of one who knows her worth. And most dangerously of all, she carried ambition. Henry saw her, and in seeing her saw more than beauty. He saw possibility. Catherine had failed him. Anne might succeed. Where Catherine's womb had given daughters and grief, Anne's might give sons. Where Catherine's body was weary, Anne's was young, untested, fertile. The king's passion for Anne was not only lust, it was dynastic desperation. This was the engine that drove England into chaos. For Anne did not yield easily. She refused to be his mistress, refused to give her body without a crown, and Henry, drunk on desire and fear for his legacy, tore his world apart to have her. He begged, pleaded, threatened, cajoled. When Rome refused him annulment, he broke with Rome itself. The Catholic Church, the Pope, centuries of tradition, he cast them aside, all for Anne, all for the promise of sons. The Act of Supremacy declared Henry head of the Church of England, master of his own destiny. Monasteries fell, wealth poured into royal coffers, priests trembled beneath new oaths. Europe gasped in shock, but Henry cared only for what would lie in the cradle. Anne became his queen in 1533, crowned with splendour, her belly already swelling with what all England prayed would be a prince. The bells tolled, the court rejoiced, the realm held its breath, and the child born was Elizabeth, a girl. The disappointment was sharp, though cloaked in celebration. Henry insisted it was only the beginning, that sons would follow. But the years ahead brought more pregnancies, more heartbreak, miscarriages and stillbirths. No living son came, the hope that had justified rebellion against Rome, the hope that had made a king tear Christendom in two, withered in silence. The obsession with heirs was not Henry's alone, it seeped into every corner of English life. Courtiers watched Anne's body with hawk-like attention, whispering of every swelling belly, every pale face, every miscarriage. When she laughed too loudly, some muttered that it was the sign of a barren woman's hysteria. When she wept, they said it was God's judgment. Every month her womb failed to quicken was a national crisis, every miscarriage a prophecy of doom. For Anne, the pressure was suffocating. She was not queen for her wit or her beauty, though both were remarkable. She was queen because she was expected to deliver what Catherine had not. Her crown was built on the fragile hope of sons, and each time her body betrayed her, that crown cracked a little more. By the mid-1530s, Henry's gaze had begun to wander. Jane Seymour, pale and demure, offered a contrast to Anne's fire. Courtiers eager to see Anne fall whispered that Jane might succeed where both Catherine and Anne had failed. The king listened, his passion cooled, and with it, Anne's position grew perilous. In such a climate, slander flourished. To accuse a queen of adultery was shocking but believable, for what woman would not seek comfort when her husband turned away? To accuse her of witchcraft was blasphemous but plausible, for how else explain her failure to bear sons? But incest struck at the very heart of dynastic fear. If Anne's womb produced a child of her brother, it was not merely adultery, it was dynastic collapse, it was chaos dressed in flesh. Thus the whispers of incest found their place in Tudor England. They were not random cruelty, but strategic weapon. They struck at the very obsession that defined the age. For a queen's body was not her own, it was the property of the kingdom, the vessel of its future. To accuse Anne of corrupting that vessel with her brother's seed was to accuse her not merely of sin, but of treason against England itself. And so the stage was set. A kingdom obsessed with heirs, a king desperate for sons, a queen whose womb betrayed her. Into this crucible of fear and desire, the charge of incest was dropped like a spark into dry tinder. Whether true or false mattered little. What mattered was that England would believe it, because England had been primed to believe anything that explained the absence of a son. In the flickering torchlight of the tower, Anne's prayers rise like smoke. Beyond the walls the scaffold waits. Beyond the scaffold a child named Elizabeth toddles in the royal nursery, unknowing that her mother's fall will become her inheritance. And over all of England hangs the same relentless question: who will be the heir? Who will carry the Tudor name into the future? The obsession with heirs has consumed kings and queens, toppled marriages, broken churches and shattered crowns. Now it has consumed Anne Boleyn, and soon it will consume her brother too. Before she was a queen, before she was the most infamous woman in England, Anne Boleyn was a girl with clever eyes and a mind sharper than most dared wield. Her story begins not in London, but in the halls of diplomacy, in the courts of Europe, where she learned the art of survival long before she ever set eyes on Henry Tudor. Born around 1501 at Hever Castle in Kent, Anne was not destined for royalty. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier with a taste for advancement, and Lady Elizabeth Howard, of noble though not lofty blood. The Boleyns were not ancient aristocracy, but they were hungry. Thomas Boleyn saw in his children stepping stones to power, and so, while many English girls were raised to embroider and obey, Anne was sent abroad, to Burgundy, then to France, to drink from the wells of culture, wit and charm that England could not provide. It was in the glittering courts of Margaret of Austria and later Queen Claude of France that Anne's mind was honed. She learned languages, French with fluency, Latin enough to impress, English sharpened with continental flourish. She learned music, poetry, and the subtle dance of flirtation that defined courtly life. But more than lessons of tongue or instrument, she learned survival. She watched queens manoeuvre, mistresses rise and fall, courtiers wield whispers like daggers. She saw how a glance could be weapon, how a rumour could crown or destroy. In France she absorbed not only fashion but cunning, not only grace but fire. When Anne returned to England in the mid-1520s, she was unlike any woman at court. She was not the fairest. Her rivals had pale skin, golden mummy hair, the soft features of classical beauty. Anne's looks were darker, sharper, more striking than pretty. Her true power lay elsewhere. In her wit, her eyes that seemed to see through you, her ability to make men feel both challenged and desired in the same breath. She had the rare gift of making conversation feel like seduction, and silence like a promise. It was this that caught Henry VIII. By then, Henry had been king for nearly 2 decades. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced one daughter, Mary, but no living sons. His need for an heir grew desperate, his frustration heavy. He had taken mistresses before, some from court, even Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn. But Anne was different. She did not yield. She did not flutter her lashes and fall into his bed at first summons. She held back. She deflected, teased, denied. In her resistance, Henry found not rejection but obsession. It began with glances, then letters, then promises. Henry poured his soul into parchment, writing words of longing that survive to this day. "I beg you to give yourself body and heart to me," he wrote, "and to let us enjoy one another as lovers." Anne replied with caution, always careful, never fully surrendering. She dangled what Henry craved but denied its consummation. She told him she would not be his mistress. If he wanted her, he must make her his wife. And so the game became a war. Henry, used to obedience, found himself entranced by defiance. Anne, daughter of an ambitious but middling family, had set herself on a throne she did not yet hold. For years the pursuit burned. Henry showered her with jewels, with letters, with promises. He sought annulment from Catherine, begging Rome for release. When the Pope delayed, Anne's hold only tightened. She had become more than a mistress. She was a cause, a reason to reshape kingdoms. In 1527, Henry's great matter began. He argued that his marriage to Catherine was invalid, cursed by God because she had once been his brother's wife. He claimed their lack of sons proved divine judgment. He demanded annulment. Rome refused, unwilling to offend Catherine's nephew, the powerful Emperor Charles V. For 7 long years the struggle dragged on. Anne waited, Henry fumed, Catherine prayed, all of England whispered. Anne's rise was not passive, she was no silent prize. She wrote letters, advised Henry, pressed her allies into service. She studied scripture, offering Henry passages that seemed to support his cause. She spoke with reformers, aligning herself with new religious thought. Whether out of conviction or convenience, she became a symbol of change, a queen not of Rome, but of England itself. And when Henry broke with the Pope, declaring himself head of the Church of England, Anne's triumph was sealed. She was crowned queen in 1533. The coronation was magnificent, a river of pageantry flowing through London. Crowds gathered, some cheering, some muttering. Anne rode in splendour, her dark eyes shining, her crown gleaming, her belly already swelling with the child the nation prayed would be a prince. The bells rang, the trumpets blared, the city burned with light and noise. Yet beneath the pomp, resentment smouldered. Many still loved Catherine. Many saw Anne as usurper, seductress, witch, but Anne did not tremble. She laughed. She walked proudly. She basked in the role she had fought so long to win. In that moment, she seemed untouchable. When her child was born, however, the celebration soured. It was Elizabeth, a girl. Henry concealed his disappointment, insisting sons would follow. Yet each year that passed without one, Anne's hold weakened. Her sharp wit, once alluring, became irritant. Her temper, once charming, was now branded arrogance. Enemies gathered. Catherine's supporters whispered. Henry's eye began to stray toward Jane Seymour, quiet, pale, submissive, the very opposite of Anne. And yet, in those first years, Anne was at the height of her power. She was no meek queen consort. She was active in politics, bold in opinion, unafraid to quarrel with Henry himself. She championed reform, argued over policy, influenced appointments. She was loved fiercely by her supporters, hated bitterly by her enemies. Few were indifferent. But the very traits that brought her to the throne now prepared her downfall. In a world where queens were meant to obey, Anne defied. In a world where queens were meant to soothe, Anne provoked. In a world where queens were meant to serve as wombs, Anne's womb betrayed her. The daughter of an ambitious courtier had risen to the highest crown in England. She had forced kings to bow, popes to resist, churches to crumble. She had held a nation's fate between her hands. But the same fire that lifted her would soon consume her, for in the Tudor court the higher one climbed, the sharper the knives waited below. Anne Boleyn's rise was not merely ascent, it was foreshadow. Every duel, every triumph, every coronation, song carried beneath it the whisper of doom. The tower already stood, patient, waiting. The razor edge of rumour already gleamed. And in the shadows, her brother George walked beside her, ally, confidant, companion, a bond that would one day be twisted into the most damning slander of all. For now, the Queen shone bright. But soon the fire would turn to ash. The story of Anne Boleyn cannot be told without her brother. George Boleyn was more than a sibling. He was her shadow, her mirror, her confidant, and in the end, the co-star in the scandal that destroyed them both. To understand the charge that would bind their names forever in infamy, one must first understand the man himself, the brother who walked so closely at Anne's side that rumour could twist loyalty into lust, devotion into damnation. George was the only son of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, born around 1504. Like Anne, he was raised in the furnace of ambition. Their father was a man of restless advancement, clawing his way upward through service, diplomacy and cunning. Thomas Boleyn was not born into greatness, but he meant his children to carry the family into it. His daughters were taught charm and grace, his son given the tools of power. George was trained to shine, to speak, to manoeuvre. He did not disappoint. By the time he entered Henry VIII's court, George was everything a Tudor courtier was expected to be. Tall, handsome, quick with words, skilled with horse and lance, witty at the feast, elegant in dress. He recited poetry with ease, wrote verses himself, danced with enviable grace, and spoke French with fluency. He was the kind of man who drew eyes in the hall, who charmed women and men alike, who slipped through the shifting currents of politics with laughter and confidence. But George's fortune was never entirely his own. He was a Boleyn, and that meant he was tethered to the rising star of his sister. When Anne caught Henry's eye, and the king's obsession turned into revolution, the whole Boleyn family rose with her. Thomas became Viscount Rochford, Elizabeth Howard presided proudly over her children's ascent, and George became Lord Rochford, knighted, ennobled, his fortunes tied irrevocably to Anne's. He was her closest ally at court. Their bond was strong, built from childhood spent in ambition's shadow, strengthened by shared years abroad, sharpened by the constant suspicion and jealousy of others. They dined together, laughed together, whispered together in corridors. George was her companion in triumph, her comfort in despair, her political partner in Henry's turbulent court. Where Anne dazzled with wit, George parried with eloquence. Where Anne was accused of arrogance, George defended with humour. Their intimacy was the kind born not only of blood, but of shared survival in a world that wished them ill. But such closeness in Tudor England was perilous. Court was a stage where every gesture became a script for gossip, a glance held too long, a touch too familiar, a laugh shared in private. All could be twisted by enemies into sin. and the Boleyns had many enemies. Noble families resented their meteoric rise. Catherine of Aragon's loyalists despised them as usurpers. Jane Seymour's faction waited like wolves for the moment to strike. Every movement of Anne and George was watched, noted, whispered upon. George himself was not without flaws. Charming he may have been, but he carried arrogance in equal measure. Some called him reckless, too fond of women, too loose with his words. He was rumoured to be unfaithful to his wife, Jane Parker, who in turn was no friend to Anne. Jane would later feed the flames of scandal with venomous testimony, her bitterness sharpening into betrayal. To their enemies, George's rumoured infidelities made him easier to paint as corrupt, his intimacy with Anne easier to poison with insinuation. Yet by all accounts, Anne and George loved one another deeply as siblings. Their letters show the warmth. Their contemporaries noted loyalty. George championed Anne at court, risked his standing to defend her cause, and stood by her when Henry's affection faltered. In Anne's darkest hours, George was there, her brother, her shadow, the one who would not abandon her. And it was precisely this closeness, so natural, so necessary, that became the most potent weapon against them. In the poisoned air of Tudor politics, proximity itself could be evidence. Cromwell, Henry's ruthless minister, understood this well. When Henry began to seek Anne's destruction, Cromwell built a case not on truth but on plausibility. Adultery alone might condemn her, but incest was monstrous, unforgettable, a charge so shocking that no defence could cleanse it. And who better to accuse than the brother always at her side? The indictment painted George as more than brother. It claimed he had carnally known the Queen, committing incest to the great peril of the royal issue. It accused him of mocking the king's virility, of sneering that Henry was impotent and Anne sought satisfaction elsewhere. It made him not only a traitor but a blasphemer of nature itself. The shock was immediate. Even in an age of brutal rumour, incest was nearly unthinkable. Courtiers recoiled. London buzzed. The Queen accused of adultery was scandal enough. The Queen accused of bedding her brother was abomination. Whether anyone truly believed it hardly mattered. The scandal itself was fatal. George must have reeled at the accusation. He was many things, courtier, poet, libertine perhaps, but to imagine him guilty of incest with his sister is almost impossible. His trial later showed no shred of evidence, only rumour and coerced testimony. Yet the very closeness that had been his strength was now his doom. In a world where siblings dined together, embraced, whispered, even jested in ways normal to family affection, enemies found the cracks to pry open. Anne's sharp wit, George's charm, their ease with one another, all became twisted into proof of monstrous crime. And in the end, George's fate was sealed not by what he did, but by what Anne failed to do, produce a son. Their intimacy was made scapegoat for dynastic failure. If the Queen could not give a prince, perhaps it was because the child's blood was tainted. Perhaps, enemies whispered, the womb was poisoned by incest. The line corrupted at its root. On the day of his arrest, George was taken swiftly, his titles stripped, his friends silenced. He faced the Tower with composure, but even he must have known the charge was death before it ever reached the courtroom. His sister's shadow had been his blessing. Now it was his curse. History remembers George Boleyn less vividly than Anne. His name is bound to hers, his fate eclipsed by the brilliance of her tragedy. But without him, her fall could never have been made so dark. The incest charge was the blade that cut deepest, the scandal that turned a queen's downfall into a monstrous parable. George was both victim and instrument of her destruction, her brother, her ally, her shadow twisted into the face of her doom. When he died, beheaded on Tower Hill in May 1536, it was not only his blood that stained the ground, but the final bond of loyalty that had defined Anne's life. Brother and sister, so close in life, were destroyed together by slander that has echoed across centuries. In the end, George Boleyn was not remembered for his poetry, his charm, his wit, or his courtly grace. He was remembered as the man accused of sharing a queen's bed. He was remembered as Anne Boleyn's shadow, the mirror in which her enemies painted incest. And in that memory, distorted, grotesque, he remains trapped, a ghost forever at her side. Every Tudor marriage began with ceremony, but few ended with love. For Henry and Anne Boleyn, theirs began not with ceremony at all, but with years of pursuit, rebellion, and ruin. By the time the vows were spoken, the cracks were already forming. What had begun in fire would end in ash. In the earliest days, Henry's passion for Anne burned with the fever of obsession. He wrote her letters so tender, so desperate, that they shock us even now. Words of a king humbling himself before a woman, begging for her favour, swearing eternal devotion. He promised her a crown, he promised her sons, he promised her eternity, and for a while Anne returned fire with fire. She was his most dear and entirely beloved. She was his world, but passion, even when it burns hottest, cannot last forever. By the early 1530s, the flame was already dimming. Anne had given him Elizabeth, clever, vigorous, but a girl. Sons did not come. In 1534 she suffered a miscarriage, a bitter blow. In 1535 another. Each time Henry's face darkened. Each time Anne wept alone in her chamber, while rumours hissed through the court, and each time the courtiers muttered what Henry himself began to believe. This marriage was cursed. The king's moods shifted like storm clouds over the Thames. One day he embraced Anne, swore she was his only love, defended her fiercely against gossip. The next he raged, blaming her for every miscarriage and every quarrel, every insult to his pride. He was a man who demanded both obedience and adoration, and Anne, sharp-tongued and proud, gave him neither in sufficient measure. Her wit, once intoxicating, now cut him like a knife. Her defiance, once thrilling, now infuriated. Meanwhile the court turned colder. The Queen had never been popular. Catherine of Aragon, the discarded wife, still commanded sympathy. Catherine's daughter Mary, though bastardized in law, remained beloved by many. To the old nobility, Anne was the upstart, the witch, the seductress who had bewitched the king into sin. To the common people she was a usurper, a destroyer of England's union with Rome, the cause of their spiritual uncertainty. Her miscarriages were read as divine judgment. Every stillborn child was proof in their eyes that God cursed her marriage. Anne knew she was hated. She knew too that her hold on Henry grew weaker with each passing month. And so she clung closer to her family, especially her brother George. He remained her greatest defender, her most loyal companion. When Henry sulked, George comforted. When Henry raged, George counselled. They dined together, read poetry aloud, laughed in private as siblings do. But in the poisonous air of Tudor politics, such closeness became dangerous. Enemies whispered, "Why does the Queen spend so much time with her brother? Why does she confide in him more than her husband? Why does she smile at George when her face grows cold at Henry?" What was innocent affection became fodder for scandal. The court was a nest of spies, and every word, every gesture could be twisted. Jane Seymour's star began to rise at this time. Pale, quiet, submissive, she was everything Anne was not. Where Anne argued, Jane obeyed. Where Anne burned with wit, Jane bowed her head and blushed. Henry noticed. He lingered near her in corridors, pressed coins into her hand, sent gifts. Jane accepted them with downcast eyes, presenting herself as virtue incarnate. Anne seethed. She scolded Henry, railed against Jane, tore the gifts from her rival's hands. But her anger only deepened Henry's resolve. He was weary of quarrels, weary of accusations. Jane's silence was balm. Anne's voice was fire. The king's heart shifted, and with it the balance of power. Factions formed around Jane, whispering promises of peace if Anne were gone, promises of sons if Jane were queen. Cromwell, Henry's minister, saw his opportunity. He and Anne had once been allies, but now they were enemies, clashing over religion and power. Cromwell understood Henry's heart better than anyone. He knew the king's passion had curdled into resentment, and resentment needed only a spark to become destruction. It was at this moment that Anne's reliance on George became fatal. He was her shield, her confidant, her anchor. When Henry withdrew, George drew nearer. When courtiers snubbed her, George sat beside her. He defended her in council, jested with her at feasts, accompanied her in private hours. The bond of siblings became the talk of enemies, and Cromwell, watching, sharpened it into a weapon. Henry too began to brood. He was a man obsessed with his own virility. To be mocked for impotence was his greatest fear. Whispers reached him that George had laughed at his manhood, that Anne had complained of his failure to father sons. Whether these words were ever spoken hardly mattered. In Henry's ears they became truth. Pride wounded, masculinity questioned, he turned colder still. The royal marriage unravelled in full view of the court. Feasts once filled with music now rang with silence between king and queen. Anne's once proud place beside Henry grew precarious. Jane Seymour lingered just behind. Courtiers sensed the shift and adjusted accordingly. Men who once fawned upon Anne now bowed to Jane. The Queen, once radiant in triumph, now stood isolated, her eyes flashing with fury she could no longer conceal. Anne must have known. She must have felt the scaffold already rising beneath her feet. A queen who failed to give sons could not remain queen. Catherine had learned this lesson slowly, over decades. Anne learned it brutally, in only a few years. The crown that once seemed secure now slipped with every miscarriage, every quarrel, every whisper, and yet she did not bow meekly to her fate. Anne fought. She scolded Henry, pleaded with him, tried to charm him anew. She quarrelled with Cromwell, threatened him, swore that her enemies would not triumph. She leaned on George, who encouraged her still to hope. But the tide had turned. Passion had become resentment. Love had become fatigue. Hope had become accusation. The Queen's body, once seen as England's salvation, was now condemned as its curse. Her very womb became symbol of failure, and when the charge of incest came, it would seem to Henry not absurd but plausible. The final proof that his marriage was doomed by sin, that God had punished him not with barren years, but with corruption at his very side. Anne and George's closeness, once her comfort, was now her doom. The marriage that had begun in defiance of Rome, in fire and passion, was crumbling. Henry turned from Anne's bed to Jane Seymour's pale embrace. Cromwell sharpened his knives. The courtiers whispered their approval. And in the Tower, just weeks later, Anne would sit alone, remembering these years of decline, how love soured, how trust failed, how every glance at her brother became weapon, how every lost child became prophecy. The marriage that had reshaped Christendom ended not in peace, but in ruin. It was not the absence of sons alone that doomed her. It was the silence that grew between her and Henry, the whispers that grew. Between her and George, the court that turned against her, and the husband who chose not to defend her. The crown slipped from Anne's head long before the sword fell upon her neck. The Tudor court was not built on stone but on whispers. Its walls were painted with suspicion, its chambers echoing not with music alone, but with rumour sharpened into daggers. A word could lift a man to riches, a glance could damn a woman to ruin. For Anne Boleyn, whose very crown had been born from scandal, the danger was constant. Every movement, every word, every silence was weighed, twisted, and repeated. Anne had never been meek. She spoke her mind with a candour unusual for women and intolerable in queens. She laughed too loudly, argued too fiercely, and cut men down with words when they displeased her. In her early years as Henry's obsession, these qualities dazzled him. He adored her fire, her wit, her refusal to be docile. But once she was crowned, these same traits became liabilities. What a king once found intoxicating, his courtiers now called arrogance. What once seemed confidence, they named pride. And so the whispers began. At first they were small. Comments about her temper, her inability to charm those around her. Anne quarrelled with Cromwell over power and patronage, and suddenly there were murmurs that she overreached, that she usurped the king's authority. She dismissed maids she mistrusted, and suddenly there were rumours that she was jealous, vindictive, tyrannical. Every gesture was interpreted in the worst possible light. The miscarriages deepened the poison. Anne's womb, which should have succulent detractors with sons, betrayed her. The stillborn child of 1536, rumoured by some to be male, was the final straw for many. The king's marriage is cursed, people muttered. God denies him heirs because his queen is a sinner. And sinners, in Tudor imagination, were not merely disobedient, they were dangerous. It was around this time that darker whispers arose, whispers of witchcraft. Anne had always been accused of bewitching Henry, of casting a spell so strong that it tore England from Rome. Her dark eyes, her flashing temper, her refusal to yield were described not as strength but as sorcery. Some claimed she had a sixth finger, a mark of the devil. Others whispered that she carried charms, that she seduced the king with potions. Her miscarriages were punishment for dealing in forbidden arts. But witchcraft alone was not enough. It explained passion, it explained failure, but it did not destroy dynasties. To bring down a queen, one needed something more intimate, more poisonous. And so adultery entered the air. The Tudor court was a cage of proximity, Men and women lived, dined and conversed together daily, to entertain courtiers with wit, to laugh at their jokes, to dance at banquets. All this was expected of a queen. But for Anne, every smile was a potential weapon against her. Her sharp banter with courtiers was painted as flirtation, her easy laughter as seduction. She was accused of enjoying too much company, of lingering too long in conversation, of lowering her guard. Documents from the later trials show names whispered into the record: Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton. Some were gentlemen of the King's Privy Chamber, some musicians, some friends of George. Each had been seen in Anne's presence, had spoken with her, had perhaps exchanged harmless compliments. But in the poisoned atmosphere of 1536, these gestures became evidence of adultery. A compliment became a promise, a glance became a caress, a shared word became a tryst. The most vulnerable was Mark Smeaton, the court musician. He was lowborn, ambitious, desperate for favour. He often lingered in Anne's chambers, playing his lute, seeking patronage. When Cromwell's men seized him, he was easy prey, threatened, tortured. He confessed, or so the records claim, to lying with the Queen. Whether he did so to save himself or under unbearable pressure we cannot know. But once one man's confession was recorded, the rest fell into place. The court was convinced. The Queen had lovers. The Queen was a whore, yet even adultery was not enough for Cromwell nor for Henry's wounded pride. To accuse Anne of adultery was to say she betrayed her husband, but to accuse her of incest with her brother George was to say she betrayed nature itself, God himself, the very order of the world. And so the darkest whisper of all took shape. It had roots in what all had seen: Anne and George's closeness. They dined together. They shared confidences. They defended one another in council. They were bound by loyalty and affection, as siblings should be. But in the fevered imaginations of enemies, this bond became perverse. Jane Boleyn, George's own wife, provided testimony that suggested impropriety. Whether out of bitterness, coercion, or personal spite, she claimed to have seen her husband and Anne in suspicious intimacy. Cromwell seized upon it. The indictment would later record it plainly that Anne had carnally known her brother, committing incest, and that she did so in despair of producing a son by the king. It was an accusation both impossible and unforgettable. To the court, to the people, it did not matter whether it was true. It mattered that it could be believed, because Anne was already despised, already branded witch and seductress. The whispers spread like plague. In taverns, men drank and muttered that the Queen had lain with half the court. In churches, preachers thundered against her corruption. On the streets, women spat at her name. The more shocking the rumour, the more eagerly it was repeated. And Anne in her chambers could do nothing. Her laughter, her tears, her words of protest, all were interpreted as signs of guilt. For a queen in Tudor England, innocence was not protection. Reputation was everything. And Anne's had been blackened beyond repair. By the spring of 1536, the whispers had hardened into conviction. Cromwell's web was woven, Henry's heart was cold, and the court was ready to see its scandal-made spectacle. Anne Boleyn had gone from beloved to despised, from queen to monster, from hope of England to curse upon it. And the whisper that had begun as sin would soon thunder as accusation in the King's Hall of the Tower itself. The Queen who once laughed at her enemies now heard their voices in every corner. The court no longer needed proof. It had whispers, and in Tudor England, whispers killed. The spring of 1536 was drenched in fear. The air of the Tudor court, once scented with incense and roses for Easter Mass, now carried the odour of something rotten. Betrayal, conspiracy, death. It was in this season that the whispers, long murmured in taverns and corridors, hardened into something more deadly: parchment, ink, and seal. Anne Boleyn was no longer merely disliked, no longer merely distrusted. She was about to be destroyed. The indictment against her was unlike anything England had ever seen. Queens had been accused of adultery before, of witchcraft, even of treason. But incest, gastel, incest was something darker, unspeakable, monstrous. It carried with it not just the stain of sin, but the taint of apocalypse. For if it were true that the Queen had lain with her own brother, then the very line of succession to the future of England was poisoned. Any child born of such a union would not only be illegitimate, but damned in the eyes of God and men alike. The charges were drawn up with careful malice. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men: Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn. Their names would be inked into the annals of infamy, though their crimes were less real than the ambition of Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who orchestrated the Queen's fall with cold precision. But it was the final name, George, that turned scandal into nightmare. According to the indictment, Anne had not merely entertained men with flirtations and secret meetings, she had corrupted her very brother, committing incest in despair of issue male by her lord the king. She had, they said, sought to conceive by George what Henry had failed to give her, a son. It is difficult even now to read such words without flinching. To the 16th century mind, the horror was magnified 100-fold. Incest was not only unnatural, it was diabolical. It was a crime against divine order, one that blurred the line between man and beast. To accuse a queen of it was to transform her into a monster, less woman than witch, less mother than corrupter. The indictment went further still. It claimed Anne and George had mocked the king in their intimacy, that George had boasted of the king's impotence, that Anne had complained of his failure as a man. To Henry, whose pride rested as much in his bed as on his throne, this was unforgivable. He could perhaps bear a wife's coldness, even a wife's betrayal, but to be mocked, to be ridiculed, to be painted impotent in his own court, this was a wound deeper than treason. Historians today dismiss the charges as impossible. No credible evidence was ever presented. Testimonies contradicted themselves. Dates did not align. Witnesses were coerced or bribed. The records read like theatre, not trial. And yet in 1536, truth mattered less than plausibility, and plausibility mattered less than desire. Henry wanted Anne gone, Cromwell needed her destroyed. The indictment was the instrument of their will, and it was crafted with brilliance. Adultery alone might shame a queen, but it might also invite sympathy. A neglected wife, a woman driven to seek comfort. Witchcraft might terrify, but it could be dismissed as superstition. Incest, however, admitted no defence. It was too shocking, too foul. To be accused was to be guilty in the eyes of most. Worst, no one would rise to defend a queen accused of bedding her brother. No one would risk their reputation, their soul, by speaking on her behalf. It was the perfect weapon. Anne herself, when informed of the charges, reportedly laughed in disbelief. Laughed, a laugh too sharp, too brittle, echoing off the cold stone walls of the tower. "It is most false," she is said to have cried, "for I have a good brother." Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, noted her mood in his letters to Cromwell. Laughter, tears, hysterical shifts. He recorded every word, every gesture, for in those days, even the Queen's emotions were treated as evidence. Her laughter was painted as madness, her denials as guilt, her calm as calculation. Whatever she did, it confirmed the verdict already decided. George Boleyn's reaction is less recorded, but we know he was stunned. To be accused of adultery with the Queen was one thing. To be accused of incest with his sister was another. He faced it with composure as he would later at trial, but even he must have felt the weight of the accusation crushing him. His closeness to Anne, their dinners, their confidences, their sibling affection, all were twisted now into proof of sin. His wife, Jane Parker, gave testimony against him, feeding Cromwell the poison he required. Whether from spite, coercion, or calculation, her words sealed her husband's fate. The court devoured the scandal. In taverns, men muttered with glee that the Queen had bedded half the court. In churches, preachers thundered that God's justice had finally unmasked a Jezebel. On the streets, crowds gossiped with morbid fascination. How often? Where? With whom? Truth was irrelevant. The more obscene the tale, the more eagerly it was believed. For Henry, the charges were a gift. He needed no papal dispensation this time, no years of wrangling. He had reason enough to rid himself of Anne, to erase the marriage, to pursue Jane Seymour with a clean conscience. By branding Anne as adulteress and George as her partner in sin, Henry not only freed himself but humiliated the Boleyn family, destroyed their influence and silenced the woman who had defied him. But for Anne, the accusation of incest was more than political. It was personal annihilation. To be accused of adultery was to be called unfaithful. To be accused of witchcraft was to be called dangerous. But to be accused of incest was to be called inhuman, less mother than monster, less queen than beast. It stripped her of dignity, of humanity, of even the sympathy of her enemies. It made her not tragic but grotesque. In the dim light of her prison cell, Anne must have replayed every moment with George, every shared laugh, every whispered conversation, every gesture of affection. She must have cursed the day she leaned so heavily upon him, though her heart told her it was loyalty, not lust. She must have known that nothing she said would matter now. Her enemies had chosen their weapon well. Incest was the charge that no queen could survive, and so the indictment was read, the names inked, the dates listed, the acts described in chilling detail. Anne and George, bound by blood, were bound now by accusation. Their fates were joined in scandal, their reputations fused in infamy. Brother and sister, queen and courtier, they had risen together. Now they would fall together. In the tower, Anne laughed and wept. George prepared his defence. Outside, carpenters hammered wood into scaffolds. And in the palace, Henry smiled upon Jane Seymour, the pale and silent woman who waited to take Anne's crown. The charge of incest was more than a lie. It was a weapon designed to erase Anne Boleyn from the world of sympathy, to turn her from queen into cautionary tale, from woman into warning. It was the ultimate slander, and it worked. The day the queen was seized, the court of Henry VIII held its breath. It was the 2nd of May, 1536, when the storm broke. Anne Boleyn, once the brightest star of England, once the woman for whom kings tore down kingdoms, was summoned to appear before the council at Greenwich. She came in all her finery, though her face was pale, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She had felt the coldness in Henry's gaze for weeks, had seen the growing favour he showed Jane Seymour, had heard the whispers in corridors, but she did not yet know how far the game had turned against her. At Greenwich she stood before her husband's councillors, Cromwell, Norfolk, Suffolk, Audley, men who had once bowed to her, who had eaten at her table, who had kissed her hand. Now their eyes were hard, their voices grave. She was accused, they told her, of adultery, treason, and most monstrous of all, incest with her brother George. The words fell like stones. Anne laughed, sharp, brittle, disbelieving. "Never," she cried. "I am the king's true wife. I am his true subject. As for the rest, it is false, utterly false." Her voice rose, cracked, turned to hysterical denial. She wept, then laughed again, her emotions swinging wildly as if her body could not contain the weight of such horror. The councillors were unmoved. She was placed under arrest, a queen transformed into prisoner. Outside, her barge awaited to carry her down the Thames to the Tower of London. The same river that had once borne her in triumph for her coronation now bore her in disgrace. As she stepped aboard, the people lining the banks stared in silence, some weeping, some jeering, all eager for spectacle. The queen who had once glittered in jewels now sat slumped, her crown gone, her wrists trembling. The barge glided past the city, past St. Paul's, past the steeples and spires until the tower loomed ahead, that fortress of kings and traitors, of secrets and deaths. The sight must have pierced Anne's heart, for she knew the tower well. She had lodged there once before in 1533, on the eve of her coronation. Then it had been a palace of triumph, its walls adorned, its chambers echoing with music. Now it was a prison. The same gates that had welcomed her as queen now swallowed her as condemned. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower, met her at the landing. He recorded her words with careful hand, for Cromwell had ordered every gesture, every utterance to be noted. As her feet touched the stones, Anne fell to her knees. "I am the king's true wedded wife," she cried. "Never did I betray him in thought or in deed." Then, rising, she laughed, a laughter too sharp, too sudden, and said, "Well, I shall have justice." Kingston, watching, marked her as unsteady, her mood shifting like a tide. He sent word to Cromwell, "She doth weep, she doth laugh, she doth weep again." Anne was lodged in the royal apartments within the tower, a cruel irony, for these were the same chambers she had occupied before her coronation. Once filled with ladies and music, they were now stripped of joy, guarded by men who watched her every move. She paced, she prayed, she spoke to her attendants with nervous humour, remarking bitterly on her fall. "I shall be a saint in heaven," she told one, "for I am clear of all guilt." Meanwhile, her brother George was seized. He had been at court when the king's men approached. George, elegant, witty, beloved of poets, found himself suddenly shackled, accused of the foulest sin imaginable. He too was brought to the Tower, his face pale but his composure intact. He asked what crime could justify such a fate, and when told incest with his sister, he is said to have blanched, stunned into silence. The humiliation was not confined to prison walls. The accused courtiers, Norris, Brereton, Weston, Smeaton, were arrested as well. Each man was paraded through the streets, his name blackened, his reputation ruined. Mark Smeaton, the musician, had already confessed under pressure, sealing the fate of the rest. His low birth made him a convenient scapegoat, but his words dragged down gentlemen with him, and finally the Queen herself. London feasted on the scandal. Rumour spread faster than truth. People whispered that the Queen had lovers at all hours, that she had seduced half the court, that she had mocked the king's manhood, that she had lain with her own brother. Tales grew wild, that Anne had bewitched men with her eyes, that she had plotted the king's death, that she had conceived monstrous children of incestuous union. The more obscene the story, the more eagerly it was repeated. The Queen had become spectacle, a grotesque entertainment for a city hungry for blood. In the Tower, Anne endured interrogations. Cromwell's men questioned her relentlessly, pressing her on her relations with the accused. She denied all, her words sharp, her wit unbroken, but wit could not break iron. The verdict was already written. Cromwell needed her fall. Henry demanded it. Her innocence mattered nothing. George too was interrogated. His composure impressed many, but even his eloquence could not save him. His wife, Jane Parker, offered testimony that suggested impropriety between siblings. Whether she spoke from spite, from coercion, or from jealousy, history cannot decide, but her words provided Cromwell the fuel he needed. The humiliation of George was total, a nobleman accused not only of treason, but of perversion, his honour shredded before he could even mount a defence. And Henry, the king who had once risked Christendom for Anne, who had written her love letters filled with longing, who had crowned her queen against the will of nations, he did not come to her aid. He did not visit her in the Tower. He did not write. Instead, he rode with Jane Seymour at his side, already treating her as wife in all but name. To Anne's desperate pleas he gave no answer. To her prayers for mercy he gave silence. His heart had hardened, his passion curdled to resentment, his pride demanded vengeance. The humiliation of Anne Boleyn was complete not because she was arrested, but because she was erased. No longer was she queen, consort, partner of the king. She was Jezebel, adulteress, witch, incestuous whore. Her crown was gone, her dignity stripped, her body reduced to evidence in a trial yet to come. But in those first days of captivity, Anne still fought with the only weapons left to her, words and faith. She insisted on her innocence, proclaimed her loyalty, prayed fervently. "I have never offended the king in thought or deed," she told Kingston. "If it be so, may God never forgive me." She laughed through tears. She prayed through despair. She clung to the hope that justice might yet be found. But the Tower was not a place of justice. It was a place of endings. The arrests were the first act of the play. The trial would be the second. The scaffold would be the third. In the streets of London, people whispered eagerly. The Queen was fallen. The King would wed anew. Perhaps England would at last have a son. The city prepared for spectacle, and in the Tower Anne Boleyn waited, humiliated, broken yet unbowed, her fate already written in ink and sealed with the King's will. The Queen who had once ridden in triumph now sat in silence. The brother who had once defended her now paced in chains. Together they waited for the trial that would damn them both. The King's Hall of the Tower of London was no ordinary courtroom. It was a stage, a place where verdicts were not discovered but displayed, where justice was less about truth than theatre. On the morning of May the 15th, 1536, that stage was set for a queen. Anne Boleyn was brought from her chambers, her slender frame draped in black damask, her headdress plain but dignified. She walked with composure, though her face was pale, her lips tight. The eyes of England were upon her. Crowds pressed at the edges of the hall, eager to see the woman who had unseated a queen, toppled a church, and now stood accused of sins so monstrous they defied belief. She entered the great chamber where her peers sat in judgment, 26 nobles, the highest lords of the realm. At their head was her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, presiding as Lord High Steward. His face was stone, though his eyes betrayed unease. To condemn his niece was to stain his family forever, but he had no choice. The king's will was absolute. Anne bowed with grace as if she still wore her crown. She looked not cowed but queenly, her dark eyes meeting the Lord's with a steadiness that unsettled more than it comforted. For a moment there was silence. Then the charges were read. Adultery, treason, incest. The words rolled through the hall like thunder. She was accused of betraying the king with Norris, Brereton, Weston, Smeaton, and most horribly with her own brother George. She was accused of mocking the king's manhood, of plotting his death, of corrupting the very bloodline of England. Anne listened in silence, her hands clasped. When the list of charges was complete, she lifted her chin and spoke. Her voice, though trembling at first, grew stronger as she went. "My lords, I stand before you not as a traitor, not as a sinner, but as your queen. I have never been untrue to my husband in thought or deed. I have borne him a daughter, and though it pleased not God to grant us sons, I am blameless in this. As for these men, I call them innocent as myself. I have never wronged the king. I have never known my brother, but as a brother. These charges are false, foul, and monstrous. May God be my witness." Her words hung in the air. Some in the crowd murmured in sympathy, others spat unmoved, but among the nobles who sat in judgment, there was no stirring of conscience. They knew their verdict long before her words. The witnesses were called. Their testimony was vague, contradictory, coerced. One swore she had been present when Anne conversed too warmly with Norris. Another claimed to have overheard laughter with Weston. Jane Parker, George's wife, hinted at improper familiarity between siblings. Mark Smeaton's confession, extracted under pressure, was read aloud. Each piece of testimony was flimsy, but stacked together, they formed a wall impossible to scale. Anne listened with composure, though at times her eyes flashed with indignation. When allowed to respond, she spoke with brilliance, her wit cutting through the absurdities of the accusations. She asked how she could have committed adultery in places she had not even been, how she could have consorted with men on days she was pregnant or recovering from childbirth. She pointed out contradictions, errors, impossibilities. Her defence was sharp, logical, devastating, but it was futile. The trial was not a search for truth, but a ritual of condemnation. Every noble in the hall knew what verdict was expected. To acquit Anne would be to defy the king, to challenge Cromwell, to risk one's own life. Justice was already decided before the first word was spoken, yet Anne did not falter. Even in defeat she fought with words, her only weapon left. Those present remarked later on her composure, her eloquence, her courage. One chronicler wrote, "She made so wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her, excusing herself with her words so clearly, as though she had never been guilty to them." It was the performance of a lifetime, not acting, but truth spoken against lies, dignity maintained in the face of annihilation. Still, the lords retired briefly and returned with the inevitable verdict. Guilty. Guilty of adultery, guilty of treason, guilty of incest. The Duke of Norfolk, his voice shaking despite himself, pronounced the sentence, "Because thou hast offended against our sovereign the king's grace in committing treason against his person, and here attained of the same, the law of the realm is this, that thou shalt be burned here within the Tower of London, on the green, else to have thy head smitten off as the king's pleasure shall be further known." Anne bowed her head, then raised it high. "My lords," she said, her voice calm, "I do not say I have been as humble toward the king as I might have been. But I deny him not in any wise, and I say to you all that I am clear from all the offences you have laid to my charge. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler or more merciful prince there never was." It was a remarkable statement, defiance tempered with submission, denial wrapped in loyalty. She praised the very man who had condemned her, knowing her words would echo beyond her death. The hall emptied, the sentence sealed. Outside, the city buzzed with the verdict. A queen was guilty, a queen was monstrous. A queen would die. In her chamber that night, Anne must have replayed the trial in her mind, the lords' hard faces, the absurd charges, her uncle's trembling voice, her own words falling like pebbles into a sea of silence. She had spoken truth, but truth had no weight in the court of Henry VIII. She was not condemned because she was guilty. She was condemned because she was inconvenient. Because her womb had failed to give a son, because her husband desired another woman, because Cromwell required her destruction to secure his own power. The trial had been theatre, and Anne had played her part with brilliance. But the script was written before she stepped onto the stage, and so she waited in her chamber, the walls pressing close, the scaffold being raised outside. Her brother's trial awaited him next, his fate already as certain as hers. The Queen had been humiliated, condemned, destroyed. All that remained was the executioner's blade. 2 days before Anne faced her peers, her brother stood in the same hall accused of the same monstrous crimes. It was May the 15th, 1536. The King's Hall at the Tower of London, heavy with banners and the gaze of peers, was once again transformed into a stage. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, entered the chamber with a composure that startled those watching. He was dressed in black velvet, his face pale but steady, his bearing noble. He bowed low to the lords who would decide his fate, lords who, like his sister's judges, already knew the verdict they must deliver. The charges were read aloud. He was accused of committing incest with his sister, the Queen. He was accused of mocking the king's virility, of saying Henry was unable to satisfy his wife, of spreading treasonous words in his jests. He was accused of betraying not only his monarch, but the very laws of God and nature. The hall buzzed with horrified fascination. Incest was not merely crime, it was abomination. To accuse a nobleman of such sin was to strip him not only of honour, but of humanity. The words themselves were weapons designed to kill reputation as surely as any blade would kill the body. George listened in silence, his jaw set, his eyes clear. When his turn came to speak, he did so with eloquence. His defence was measured, rational, devastating. He denied every charge with dignity. He pointed out contradictions, questioned the credibility of witnesses, demanded evidence where there was none. Chroniclers would later remark that he defended himself so well that several of those present believed he would be acquitted. But acquittal was impossible. The king's pride had been wounded too deeply. To suggest he was impotent, that his wife mocked him, that his brother-in-law repeated such jests, this was treason in Henry's mind. And Cromwell, eager to crush the Boleyn faction, had ensured that no defence could prevail. The trial was performance, and the script demanded guilt. One of the most damning pieces of testimony came from George's own wife, Jane Parker, Lady Rochford. Their marriage had been loveless, embittered, perhaps even hostile. Jane had long resented Anne's dominance at court and George's indifference at home, whether out home, of spite, jealousy, or coercion. She gave evidence that hinted at improper intimacy between brother and sister. "I think my husband and the Queen are not so innocent as they appear," she allegedly told investigators. Her words were twisted into confirmation of incest, a blade thrust straight into George's back. George stood tall even as the accusations grew grotesque. He did not beg for mercy. He did not weep. He answered with wit, with reason, with courage. Some said his calm unnerved the judges, for it forced them to confront the injustice of their role, yet none dared defy the king's will. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, George did not collapse. He bowed again, accepting the inevitable. The sentence was read. He was to be drawn to Tyburn, hanged, disemboweled and quartered, as traitors were. But Henry, in a final gesture of mercy, commuted it to beheading. It was small comfort. George knew that in 2 days his head would fall upon the block. What stung most was not the verdict, but the humiliation. The charge of incest had blackened his name beyond redemption. He was no longer remembered as poet, courtier, wit or nobleman. He was remembered as the brother who bedded the Queen. Even as he prepared for death, he must have known that his reputation was already damned, his legacy twisted into scandal. That night in his cell, George composed his thoughts. Some accounts suggest he wrote verses, others that he prayed fervently. What we know for certain is that he faced death with remarkable composure. When he walked to the scaffold on May the 17th, he delivered a speech remembered for its eloquence. He confessed no crimes but urged the crowd to pray for his soul and to live virtuously themselves. His dignity in death contrasted sharply with the monstrous charges laid upon him. Anne, imprisoned in her own chamber, surely heard of his trial, perhaps even caught echoes of the verdict. When word reached her that her brother had been condemned, she is said to have wept bitterly, then laughed with despair, her mind fraying under the weight of grief and fear. They had risen together, siblings bound by ambition and loyalty. Now they would fall together, bound forever in scandal. The trial of George Boleyn was more than the destruction of a man. It was the perfection of Cromwell's strategy. By accusing him of incest with Anne, Cromwell ensured that her fall would be total, her honour destroyed beyond repair. A queen guilty of adultery was a tragedy. A queen guilty of incest was a monster. And George, by his very existence at her side, provided the necessary shadow. The King's Hall emptied. The verdict was carried across the city. Londoners whispered, shuddered, laughed, prayed. A nobleman had fallen, a queen was damned, and the axe was being sharpened. The Tower itself seemed to groan with the weight of their doom. George Boleyn's trial was not justice, it was theatre. He played his part with dignity, but the ending was written long before he spoke a word. He was condemned not because of what he had done, but because of who his sister was, and because his king wished him gone. In the darkness of his cell, George awaited the scaffold. Across the Tower, Anne awaited hers, and all of England awaited the spectacle that would end them both. Dawn broke over the Tower of London on May the 17th, 1536, with a stillness so heavy it seemed the very stones held their breath. The sky was grey, the river black, the air damp with spring rain. Within the fortress walls, men sharpened blades, erected scaffolds, prepared the ground for blood. For this was no ordinary morning. This was the morning a queen's brother would die. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, rose from his cell with composure. He had not been broken by the days of confinement, nor by the grotesque charges laid against him. To his attendants he seemed calm, even serene, though the shadow of death loomed close. He had known since his trial that there would be no escape. His defence, brilliant though it was, had meant nothing. He had been condemned the moment Cromwell inked the indictment. That morning he dressed carefully, as if for court rather than death. He chose a gown of black velvet, sober and noble. He arranged his hair neatly, his face composed. If he must die, he would die as a Boleyn, proud, elegant, unbowed. The bells tolled as he was led from his cell. Soldiers flanked him, their halberds gleaming in the pale light. Crowds had gathered outside the Tower, pressing close to the scaffold on Tower Hill. They came for spectacle, for scandal, for the chance to see the brother of the disgraced queen lose his head. Some came in sorrow, some in morbid glee, some in pious expectation of divine judgment. Children perched on shoulders, women whispered prayers, men jostled for a better view. The air smelled of wet wood, of sweat, of anticipation. George mounted the steps with steady stride. The scaffold loomed above the throng, the axe resting beside the block. He turned to face the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the sea of faces. He did not tremble, he did not weep. Instead, he began to speak. His speech, later recorded by chroniclers, was remarkable not for bitterness but for grace. He confessed no incest, no treason, no adultery. Instead, he spoke of sin in general, urging the crowd to live godly lives, to avoid the vanities of the world. "I am come hither," he declared, "to die, for according to the law, and therefore I am ready to die. And thank God heartily that I am in a right good mind and in the death of a good Christian man. I trust to be saved by none other means, but only by the mercy of God in the merits of his only Son, Jesus Christ." He admitted he had been a sinner, as all men are, and asked forgiveness of any he had wronged. But he denied nothing specific, offered no defence, gave no scandalous confession. His dignity in that moment stood in stark contrast to the lurid charges that had damned him. To the crowd it was a moment of silence. Here was a man accused of monstrous sin, and yet he spoke like a saint. Some chroniclers later whispered that George had made light jests even as he faced death, that he maintained his wit until the end. Whether true or embroidered, the image clung, George Boleyn, charming and eloquent, unbroken even at the scaffold. When he finished, he knelt. He removed his outer garments, arranged himself before the block, and prayed softly. The executioner, axe in hand, stood ready. A hush fell over Tower Hill. The crowd, so eager for blood moments before, now held its breath. The axe rose, gleamed in the weak light, and fell. With a single stroke, George Boleyn's head was severed from his body. The crowd gasped, some crossing themselves, some crying out, some indignant. Blood darkened the scaffold, soaking into the wood. The body was lifted, the head displayed briefly, then both carried away for burial within the Tower. And just like that, a life of wit, poetry, ambition and loyalty was reduced to a head in a basket, a name blackened by scandal. Anne, imprisoned in her chamber within the tower, surely heard the bell toll, the murmur of the crowd, the muffled roar as the axe fell. She knew then that her brother was dead. Chroniclers record that she wept bitterly, then laughed, that same brittle, broken laughter that had haunted her since her arrest. "My poor brother," she is said to have cried, "to be so cruelly slain, and for my sake." She knew that their fates were bound, that his death was prelude to her own. London buzzed with gossip in the aftermath. Some praised George's composure, his eloquence, his Christian resignation. Others repeated the charges, insisting he had been guilty, that his calm was the mask of a sinner unrepentant. But the taint of incest was too strong to wash away. His dignity at the scaffold could not erase the stain of the indictment. In the eyes of many, he would forever be the brother who bedded a queen. The execution was more than punishment. It was message. It told England that even the highest could fall, that even blood bound to the crown could be corrupted and destroyed. It told courtiers that loyalty to Anne was death, that defiance of Cromwell was folly, that Henry's will was law. It told the world that the Boleyns were finished, their ambition extinguished in blood. That night, the tower was silent save for the weeping of prisoners and the clatter of guards' boots. George Boleyn lay buried, his body in earth, his name in infamy. Anne lay in her chamber, awaiting her own execution, and Henry, far away, feasted with Jane Seymour, already shaping the future that Anne and George's deaths had purchased. George's end was swift, but his humiliation endured. History would not remember his poetry, his wit, his brilliance at court. It would remember the charge of incest, the accusation so shocking that it drowned all else. He died not as himself, but as the shadow of Anne, condemned for being too close, too loyal, too bound to his sister's fate. And so the scaffold claimed the brother, and prepared itself for the sister. The Tower of London, May 18th, 1536. The night before her death, Anne Boleyn lay awake in her chamber. The walls that had once been adorned with banners for her coronation now pressed close like a tomb. She had paced them endlessly these past weeks, her steps echoing against stone, her prayers rising into silence. Now, as the candlelight flickered low, she knelt in prayer once more, her rosary clutched so tightly her fingers ached. She knew her brother was dead. The toll of the bells 2 days earlier, the murmurs of the crowd beyond her barred window, the sudden silence that followed, she had understood. George was gone, his blood staining Tower Hill. She had wept, then laughed through her tears, the brittle laughter that had haunted her since her arrest. It was not madness, though some called it so. It was despair made sound, grief turned into a weapon of defiance. If the world would damn her as mad, she would let it, for nothing could matter now. Her thoughts turned to Elizabeth, her daughter of 2 years, toddling in the royal nursery at Greenwich, innocent of the storm that had consumed her mother. Anne whispered her name like a prayer. She would never see the child again, never hold her, never guide her. All she could do was leave her a legacy, not of shame, she prayed, but of truth. "Elizabeth," she murmured into the darkness, "do not forget me." Outside, carpenters worked by the torchlight, erecting the scaffold on Tower Green. Unlike her brother, Anne would not die on Tower Hill before the jeering throngs of London. Out of some remnant of mercy, or perhaps fear of riot, Henry decreed that she should be executed privately within the tower. The scaffold was broad, built of new timber, its block placed square at the centre. A French swordsman had been summoned, famed for his swiftness. This too was called mercy. No blunt English axe for the Queen, but a single stroke of the sword. Anne rose in the early hours, pale but calm. She dressed with care, choosing a gown of dark grey damask trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle beneath, and a mantle of ermine. On her head she wore a small headdress, her hair coiled tightly beneath. She dressed not as a prisoner, but as a queen, determined to meet death with dignity. Every choice was deliberate. If she could not control her fate, she would control her appearance, her words, her final image. Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, entered to inform her the execution would be delayed one more day. The king, he said, had changed his mind, though not his decision. Anne sighed, then laughed softly. "I thought to be dead by this time, and past my pain," she said. "Alas, poor gentleman," she added, of the guards around her. They shall tire themselves waiting for me." Even in the shadow of death, her wit flickered like a dying flame. On the morning of May the 19th, the appointed day, Anne rose early. She prayed with her chaplain, confessing her sins but denying treason, denying adultery, denying incest. She received the sacrament with tears in her eyes, then stood ready when Kingston returned. "Mr. Kingston," she said, "I hear say I shall not die afore noon, and I am very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time, and past my pain." Her composure startled those that around her. She seemed less fearful than eager for the end, as though death itself would be a relief from the torment of waiting. At 9 o'clock the guards came. Anne stepped forward with grace, her small frame seeming taller than it ever had. She was escorted from her chamber, across the green, to the scaffold that gleamed in the morning sun. A crowd had gathered, though smaller than at Tower Hill. Courtiers, officials, ladies of the court, soldiers and servants. Their eyes followed her every step. One wept quietly, others looked on with grim satisfaction. Anne mounted the scaffold with light steps, pausing to look out over the crowd. She stood tall, her face composed, her dark eyes shining. The executioner, dressed in black, stood ready with his great sword. Silence fell. Then Anne spoke. "Good Christian people," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I am come hither to die, according to the law. I am accused and condemned to die, but I would say nothing against it. I am here to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused, as I know well what the law hath judged me to. And therefore I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler and more merciful prince was there never." Her words startled many. She did not accuse Henry, did not declare her innocence beyond denying her crimes in prayer. She praised the king, the very man who condemned her. It was not weakness, but calculation. To die defiant would have endangered Elizabeth's future. To die submissive was to leave her child some chance of safety. Anne gave her last words not for herself but for her daughter. She knelt upon the straw, tucking her mantle beneath her knees. She removed her headdress, her lady stepping forward to bind her hair beneath a white coif. She prayed aloud, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my soul." The executioner stepped forward quietly, his great sword hidden behind his back. Anne turned her head slightly, expecting to see him. "Is my sword not before me?" she asked. He signalled to an assistant, who moved behind her as distraction. In that moment, as her gaze shifted, the executioner swung. The blade flashed, then fell. One stroke, her head was severed cleanly, falling into the straw. The crowd gasped, some crying out, some weeping, some silent. A great hush followed, broken only by the flutter of wings as a bird startled from the tower's walls. Her ladies rushed forward, gathering her body, wrapping it in linen, carrying it to St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. There, in a humble grave beneath the stones, the Queen was buried without monument, without crown, without some ceremony. London buzzed with the news before nightfall. The Queen was dead. The scandal of incest and adultery had ended in blood. Henry, feasting with Jane Seymour, smiled upon the future, his past already erased. Yet the people whispered still. Some pitied Anne, calling her a martyr to ambition and pride. Others reviled her, calling her Jezebel, witch and whore. But none could forget her. Anne's final hours had transformed her from queen into legend. Her words, her composure, her dignity in death ensured that she would be remembered not only for scandal but for courage, yet the charge of incest lingered, blackening her name, entwining her forever with her brother in infamy. The tower stood silent that night, its stones heavy with the memory of blood. The axe and sword were cleaned, the scaffold dismantled. But the whispers did not die. They echoed through England, through history, through centuries. The Queen was dead, but her shadow remained. The sword had fallen. The Queen was gone. Her body lay in an unmarked grave within the tower's chapel, her head buried with it, her name struck from prayers. But Anne Boleyn's story did not die with her. In some ways, it had only just begun. England was a land of parchment and quills, of chroniclers who shaped memory as much as they recorded it. The written word was weapon and monument alike. And in the weeks, months, and years following Anne's death, her image was carved not in stone but in ink, and ink is harder to wash away than blood. Immediately after her execution, official narratives spread like wildfire. Cromwell's allies ensured that records of the trials painted Anne and George as guilty beyond question. Indictments were copied, distributed, preserved in archives as though they were fact. In them, Anne was not a queen wronged, but a seductress, a traitor, a woman who had corrupted her own brother. The charge of incest, unproven and impossible though it was, became fixed in the official memory of the realm. Chroniclers repeated it eagerly. Edward Hall, whose chronicles shaped Tudor memory for decades, described Anne as a woman of great wit, but much disordered. Nicholas Sander, writing later in exile, was even more vicious, painting her as a six-fingered witch, deformed in body as in soul, who seduced the king through sorcery. He described her alleged affairs, her cruelty, her incestuous crimes, with lurid relish. These accounts were copied, repeated, believed. To many, Anne became less a woman than a cautionary tale, ambition personified, lust incarnate, Jezebel reborn. The scandal spread beyond England. In Europe, diplomats wrote home with stories of Anne's fall. Letters from ambassadors described her as adulteress and whore, her death as justice from God. In Spain, Catherine of Aragon's homeland, people rejoiced, declaring that the usurper who displaced their beloved queen had met her rightful end. In Rome, priests preached that her execution proved the hand of God against Henry's heresy. Everywhere, Anne's death was wielded as evidence of England's corruption, its break from Rome painted as the fruit of a poisoned marriage. Pamphlets carried the scandal further. Printed sheets, cheap and sensational, told tales of Anne's lovers, her witchcraft, her incest, some embellished details until they bordered on the fantastical, that she bore children with deformities, that she plotted Henry's death with poisons, that she laughed on the scaffold like a demon. The more grotesque the image, the more eagerly it was consumed. Anne became a monster in ink, her humanity erased by the quills of those who feared or hated her. But not all remembered her so. Even in her own time there were voices that doubted. Some who had seen her trial spoke of her composure, her eloquence, her dignity. A few whispered that she was innocent, that Cromwell had orchestrated her downfall to secure his own power, that Henry had sacrificed her for Jane Seymour. Yet these whispers were softer, less recorded, drowned out by the louder chorus of scandal. To write in her defence was to court danger, to condemn her was to align with the king, and so ink flowed mostly in one direction, against her. In the decades that followed, Anne's image was reshaped again and again. Elizabeth, her daughter, ascended the throne in 1558. Suddenly the daughter of the whore was Queen of England, and chroniclers softened their tones. Elizabeth could not rule, while her mother remained forever Jezebel. Writers began to emphasize Anne's virtues, her learning, her reformist zeal, her courage in the face of death. Yet even then, the incest charge lingered like a shadow. It was not always spoken, but it was never forgotten. Anne's name became battleground for memory. Catholic writers painted her as temptress and witch, the root of schism and ruin. Protestant writers recast her as martyr, a woman who died for the cause of reform, innocent of the crimes laid against her. Both sides used her, neither side allowed her to be merely human. She was always symbol, always myth, never just Anne. The incest charge, above all, gave her story its grotesque edge. Adultery could be forgiven or pitied. Witchcraft could be dismissed as superstition. But incest was unforgettable. It ensured that her downfall was not merely political but moral, not merely tragic but monstrous. Even when historians centuries later would argue her innocence, the accusation remained the most infamous detail of her life. To speak her name was to recall it. Thus Anne Boleyn's legacy was not shaped by her deeds alone, but by the pens of men who wrote her after death. She was remembered less for Elizabeth's birth than for the scandal that killed her. She was remembered less for her courage than for her supposed crimes. She was remembered not as a queen who changed England forever, but as a woman accused of lying with her brother. And in this way, the ink proved stronger than the sword. The blade ended her life, but the quill shaped her eternity. In taverns, her tale was told as moral warning. In chronicles, it was etched as fact. On stages, it was dramatized as spectacle. Across Europe, it was whispered as proof of England's corruption. The Queen had died, but the scandal had triumphed. History is not fair. It remembers not the truth, but the tale most often told. And Anne's tale, written in ink blackened by scandal, would echo for centuries as one of the darkest accusations ever laid against a queen. There are sins, and then there are taboos. In every age, certain transgressions carry a weight heavier than crime itself, for they strike at the very order of the world. In Tudor England, in all of medieval Christendom, incest was the blackest of such taboos. To accuse a queen of it was not only to condemn her as a woman, but to damn her as a monster, a breaker of nature itself. Anne Boleyn's downfall was framed with this horror, because it was the perfect weapon. But to understand why the charge clung so tightly, why it struck so deep, one must understand how incest functioned in the imagination of the age. The medieval church was obsessed with boundaries, between man and God, between husband and wife, between noble and peasant. Bloodlines were sacred, their purity guarded like holy relics. Marriage itself was controlled by canon law, and those laws were woven in a web of forbidden kinship. Cousins, uncles, in-laws, all could fall within prohibited degrees. The fear was not only of sin but of corruption, of bloodlines twisted and weakened, of kingdoms collapsing because lineage had been tainted. To the people of 16th century England, incest was not private sin, but public apocalypse. If a king's heir came from incest, the realm itself was imperiled. Wars of succession, divine wrath, civil chaos, these were the stakes. Incest was more than lust. It was treason against the body politic. Accusations of incest had long been used as political weapons. In Rome, whispers of sibling debauchery haunted emperors and their sisters, staining dynasties with corruption. In the Middle Ages, queens and noblewomen were sometimes accused of lying with brothers or uncles when politics demanded their destruction. The charge appeared precisely because it was so unbelievable. Its very obscenity made it effective. The more grotesque the rumour, the harder it was to shake. For Anne, this taboo was the perfect blade. Adultery alone might have left room for sympathy. Witchcraft could be dismissed as superstition, but incest left no refuge. Even her defenders could not speak too loudly against it, for to do so was to risk being sullied by the association. Once spoken, the word alone was enough to blacken her name forever. The closeness between Anne and George provided fertile soil for the slander. They were siblings raised in ambition, allies in court, partners in survival. They dined together, laughed together, confided in one another. Their bond was strong and visible. In another age it might have been praised as loyalty. In Tudor England it was twisted into sin. Jane Parker's testimony added fuel. George's wife, embittered and perhaps coerced, suggested that their intimacy went beyond what was proper. Whether she meant it literally, or whether her words were exaggerated by Cromwell's interrogators, the effect was the same. Her insinuations were enough. Cromwell needed only a seed, and he planted it in soil already watered with hate. And so Anne became Jezebel. Not merely adulteress, but corrupter. Not merely queen, but unnatural woman. Chroniclers eagerly painted the image. Nicholas Sander in the late 16th century described her as deformed, monstrous, lustful, beyond measure, laying with her brother when the king no longer satisfied her. His words echoed across Europe, cementing the charge in imagination. Why incest? Because it symbolized collapse. Henry's great gamble, to break with Rome, to destroy Catherine, to crown Anne, had been for one purpose only, to produce sons. And Anne had failed. Her miscarriages, her stillborn children, her daughter Elizabeth, all became signs of divine disfavour. To say she turned to her brother was to explain this failure in grotesque terms. The line was barren because it was poisoned. The Tudors were cursed because their queen was corrupt. In truth, the accusation was not only about Anne, it was about Henry, a king who could not sire sons, who had cast aside one queen for another, who had broken with the Pope and plunged his kingdom into turmoil. Such a man needed absolution. Incest provided it. If Anne was guilty, Henry was innocent. If her womb was corrupted, his virility was untouched. If she sought sons in her brother's arms, then the fault lay with her, not with him. The charge exonerated the king by damning the queen. The taboo of incest also carried a spiritual dimension. In sermons, preachers warned against lust that disregarded God's law. Incest was often used as metaphor for sin itself, a symbol of disorder and chaos. To accuse Anne of it was to frame her not only as sinner, but as embodiment of sin. She became living allegory, proof that pride and ambition led to damnation. Her fall was preached as moral warning, her death as divine justice. But behind the sermons and the chronicles lay something deeper: fascination. For all their horror, incest stories drew listeners like moths to flame. They were whispered in taverns, murmured in bedchambers, gossiped in markets. The obscenity made them irresistible. To imagine a queen in her brother's arms was both repellent and compelling, a grotesque blend of fear and desire. Anne's name became currency in this macabre economy of rumour. She was consumed by those who hated her, and by those who could not look away. Centuries later, historians would try to untangle fact from slander. Most dismissed the charge as fabrication, a weapon forged by Cromwell to ensure Anne's destruction. No evidence supports it. Every piece of testimony collapses under scrutiny. And yet, the accusation remains. Even now, her story cannot be told without it. The incest charge is the dark thread that runs through her memory, impossible to cut away. Why does it endure? Because it touches something primal. The betrayal of brother and sister is more haunting than that of husband and wife. It evokes not only lust, but corruption of blood itself. It speaks to the collapse of family, the inversion of nature, the perversion of creation. Once attached to Anne, it ensured she would never be remembered as merely human. She became myth, not woman, but archetype of taboo. Elizabeth, her daughter, would grow to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Yet even Elizabeth's glory could not erase the shadow of her mother's scandal. Whispered still at court, repeated still in chronicles, Anne's alleged incest remained part of her identity. It did not matter that it was false. It mattered that it had been written. And so Anne Boleyn lives on in history as the queen who gave birth to scandal rather than sons. The charge of incest is her shroud, woven around her by enemies, carried forward by chroniclers, preserved in memory because it horrifies. To accuse a woman of incest was to annihilate her. To accuse a queen was to annihilate her legacy. And yet, in Anne's case, it had the opposite effect. It ensured she would never be forgotten. Her story became too grotesque, too shocking, too unforgettable to fade. The taboo gave her immortality, not the immortality she sought, but one forged in darkness. The ink of scandal wrote her more deeply into history than any crown could. The incest charge was meant to erase her. Instead, it made her eternal. The Tower of London still stands. Its walls, blackened with age, rise above the Thames like teeth gnashing at the sky. Tourists walk its courtyards now, cameras in hand, guides reciting rehearsed tales. But if you pause, if you wait until the crowds thin and the evening mist curls over the battlements, the silence whispers. The tower remembers. It remembers Anne Boleyn, the chapel of Saint. Peter Advincula lies tucked within its walls, small, unassuming, its stones worn smooth by centuries of feet. Beneath its floor, in graves unmarked, lie the bodies of queens, traitors, martyrs. Somewhere among them rests Anne. No effigy marks her, no monument proclaims her. She was buried hurriedly, without ceremony, her remains mingled with others. The crown that once adorned her head is long gone. All that remains is dust. And yet Anne is everywhere. She lingers in every whisper, every tale, every shiver that passes through the tower's stones. Not because she was queen, not because she was executed, but because of the scandal that clung to her like a shroud. The charge of incest. For nearly 500 years, that word has echoed alongside her name. Historians refute it, scholars dismiss it, yet it refuses to die. It clings because it horrifies. It clings because it fascinates. It clings because it was never about truth, but about fear, power, and myth. Was Anne guilty? Almost certainly not. No credible evidence exists. The charges were contradictions piled upon lies, confessions wrung from terror, testimonies warped by jealousy and coercion. The very dates in the indictment crumble under scrutiny. The incest charge is impossibility wrapped in ink. And yet it achieved what Cromwell and Henry intended. It destroyed her honour, blackened her memory, and silenced her defenders. But myths outlive facts, and Anne became myth the moment her head struck the straw. In the centuries that followed, she was reborn in endless forms. To Catholics, she was Jezebel, the whore who bewitched a king and damned a kingdom. To Protestants, she was Martyr, a woman of learning and reform whose death heralded England's break with Rome. To poets she was tragic heroine, to pamphleteers she was monstrous seductress. Her story became theatre, ballad, sermon, scandal. Each retelling reshaped her, but the shadow of incest always hovered at the edge, the grotesque detail too delicious for storytellers to abandon. And so Anne is remembered less for her daughter Elizabeth, who became one of England's greatest monarchs, than for the charges that killed her. Less for her intelligence, her wit, her courage, than for the whispers of sin that have never been silenced. The truth is simple. Anne was a woman caught in a web of power, ambition, and obsession. She rose too high, too quickly, in a court where envy and intrigue ruled. She defied too boldly, spoke too sharply, demanded too much. She gave Henry what he demanded, a marriage that reshaped Europe, but she could not give him what he craved, a son, and for that she was destroyed. The incest charge was never truth, only weapon. But weapons kill all the same. What remains today is shadow. In the tower, guides point to her grave. Visitors lay flowers. Some swear they feel her presence, a chill on the air, a whisper in the chapel. Others claim to see her ghost walking the grounds at night, carrying her head beneath her arm, her eyes still burning with defiance. These are myths, but they speak to a deeper truth. Anne Boleyn has never left. She walks still in memory, in story, in scandal. The incest charge made her unforgettable. Without it, she might have been remembered only as Henry's discarded queen, a tragic figure eclipsed by her daughter. With it, she became legend, dark, grotesque, immortal. The charge annihilated her in life, but ensured her eternity in history. And so we return one last time to the Tower on that May morning in 1536. The scaffold gleams, the crowd waits, the sword rises. A woman kneels, small and slender, her voice steady as she commends her soul to God. The blade falls, and silence follows. But it is not silence that endures. It is whispers. Whispers of sin, of vault, of scandal, of incest. Whispers that echo still, long after bones have turned to dust. Anne Boleyn is gone, but her shadow remains. In the Tower, in the Chronicles, in the imagination of every age that retells her tale. A queen remembered not for her crown, but for a scandal so dark it outlived her. The curtain falls, the hall is empty, the scaffold is gone, but the whisper lingers. Anne Boleyn, the queen in shadow.